Well, thank you for the introduction and the opportunity to be here with you this afternoon. Sorry for a little change up in the schedule, but we're shutting everything down because snow is coming. And I have to tell you, as an Alaskan that quite honestly has been waiting for winter in Alaska, all of the hullabaloo and excitement about 2 to 4 or 3 to 6, whatever it is, coming tomorrow, it bemuses me. But I do think that it is actually somewhat astounding that the Energy Committee hearing that we have on deck for tomorrow morning at 9:30 is the first committee hearing that I believe has been held in the United States Senate on the Arctic. And it happens to be on a day when we're going to be shut down because of the weather coming apparently out of the north. So it is a slight bit of irony. But I want to thank you for your focus. I want to thank you for the leadership of so many in this room when it comes to an understanding and an appreciation of our oceans. When we think about that piece of planet Earth that truly sustains us, it is imperative that the health of our oceans is front and center. So thank you respectively for what you do in those arenas. Predicting and preparing for a changing Arctic. Well, I can tell you there's no question in my mind that we are seeing a change in the Arctic. The region is changing, it is undeniable. And so the question is, how do you predict it? How do you prepare for it? How do we deal with the reality of a changing Arctic? Because it can bring, as well as the risks and the challenges, it can bring benefits. And whether it's resource development or what we're seeing with an increase in shipping and other maritime activity, we know, and I think those of you in this room know probably more than others, there is still so much more in terms of science that we must understand, that we have to push ourselves to understand. Whether it's basic atmospheric and climate interactions, to understanding the impacts of ocean acidification, and the research and development of technologies that will transform the region and our economies. For example, in the Arctic, anthropogenic CO2 is not the only process that can make our waters more acidic, but we also have to consider what we're seeing with melting sea ice, warmer temperatures, increased river runoff. From an Alaskan perspective, we are very, very mindful that the Bering Straits there is the only oceanic gateway between the Pacific and the Arctic, providing a corridor for northward bound invasive species, as well as heat that melts the sea ice and raises the potential impact on ocean acidification. And that makes the Bering Strait region and Alaska's northern waters particularly vulnerable. And that is of concern, and it should be of concern to us. It's estimated that the waters of the Beaufort Sea could become corrosive to shell-building animals as early as 2025, 2027 for the Chukchi Sea, and then up in the Bering Sea, 2044, coming way too soon, far too fast. In addition, new observations of ocean currents show an unanticipated potential for pollutants in Russian waters to reach our shores in Alaska. We look at what is happening over in Russia. There's not a single map that you will find of the state of Alaska that doesn't show a little piece of Russia as part of that map. So we are very cognizant of what happens on the Russian side. And the question that needs to be asked is, are we prepared for a potential Russian oil spill? And my answer to that is absolutely no, we're not. For those of us in Alaska, the ocean sustains us. It nurtures us, it feeds us, it drives our economy. And we must manage our oceans with the environmental stewardship that is inherent in those who rely on its bounty. But I think it's also important to recognize that caring for the environment is not inconsistent with our other goals, which is producing jobs in the region and addressing our energy security needs as a nation. Our neighbors, Russia to the west and Canada to the east, continue with their aggressive national plans combined with state investment to develop Arctic resources and advance commerce in the north. And their plans are clearly helping to create jobs and economic growth in areas that face some pretty extraordinary challenges. Even non-Arctic nations are embracing the opportunities that come with diminished polar sea ice. And it's always interesting to me as I attend conferences, Arctic conferences in other parts of the globe, whether it's in Iceland, where we held the most recent Arctic Circle meeting, or whether it was in Sweden with the most recent Arctic Council meeting, other meetings that I have with Arctic parliamentarians. We're seeing so many more from other parts of the world who are looking at the Arctic with a keen interest. They're reaping the transit benefits and moving ahead with resource exploration and development activities. Some will say we shouldn't be doing any activity, any resource development activity up in the Arctic. Let's just, for discussion's sake, right now say, okay, we're not going to talk about that. We're not going to move on oil and gas development. That does not suggest that everything stops up north. The level of maritime commerce that we are seeing is undeniable. It is real. And it's not just coming from, for instance, Shell, who would seek to explore and produce up there. It is active in the Arctic. So again, the question is what role does the United States play? Because this level of engagement and activity is going to continue whether the United States engages or not. One of the I guess telling evidences of growing interest in the Arctic is when you go to these international conferences to see who's participating, who's listening, who is present. It was somewhat stunning to me to notice that Great Britain had a larger official contingent at the Arctic Circle meeting in Reykjavik than the United States did. Singapore is present at every one of these international meetings that we go to, and they're looking at it from a shipbuilding perspective. They're looking to capitalize on what is happening in the Arctic. It is my hope that the United States will engage and commit the necessary resources to make the Arctic a national priority. I'm working hard at the legislative level to advance some initiatives. I'm going to be introducing some legislation, hopefully very quickly, to develop a solid foundation and building blocks for that investment, including a focus on obtaining accurate data for charting the Arctic. What I'm hoping to do through legislation is make sure that when we talk about the Arctic, we know what we're dealing with, whether it's having the accurate charts and navigational aids, buoys, ice monitoring, the level of data collection that needs to go on, that must go on, is going to be important for us. From the mapping perspective, I find it phenomenal that we have more detailed maps of the surface of Mars than we do of the Arctic. The least we can do is assess the accuracy of Arctic weather and water forecasting. Look at the status of our sea ice analysis and forecast services and analyze gaps in Arctic weather and sea ice observing networks in U.S. Arctic regions. We can't ignore the changing Arctic, and that means that you have to pay attention to it by resourcing it, by ensuring that we invest in our Arctic infrastructure. Probably the most apparent piece of Arctic infrastructure is an icebreaker. Your capacity to move up there, whether it's from a search and rescue perspective, or from a commerce perspective. Icebreakers are really the measuring stick, if you will, of Arctic investment. And I would put our Arctic icebreaking capability right now at about a 0.5. We are not there. God bless the Healy, and I thank all of our Coast Guard men and women and what they do for us in the Arctic. The Healy does a very credible job for us in Alaska and for all Alaskans, but the fact of the matter is the Healy is a medium class icebreaker. It can't operate in the heavy ice. Our one operational heavy icebreaker, the Polar Star, is on contract now for the next 5 years to be down in Antarctica. So she's going to be down there for 5 years during half the year, and you would say, okay, well then we get her back up north for the summer season, but that's not the case. That's when she's going to be basically being fixed up to go back down and be beaten up down in Antarctica again. So for the next 5 years, we don't have access to that heavy operational icebreaker. And keep in mind, the Polar Star is on her second life here. And she's got about 6 to 8 more years before she will be permanently retired. I took the opportunity to go do a walkthrough of the Polar Sea that is at the docks there in Seattle. And for the mariners in the room, it just breaks your heart. Breaks your heart to see that vessel and the capacity and capability that we had there. We need a new icebreaker. The Coast Guard's own high latitude study states that it requires a total of 6 major icebreakers, 3 heavy and 3 medium, to fulfill its statutory mission. The Coast Guard has repeatedly stated that it's going to be $1 billion. It's going to be $1 billion for an icebreaker. It's going to take 10 years to build a replacement polar icebreaker. To date, Coast Guard has only allocated about $15 million to planning and design of the new polar icebreaker. President's 2016 budget has requested another $4 million. We got to get to $1 billion here. This is not the kind of commitment that we need. This isn't a serious investment for a national asset. And this is a point that I want to ensure that not only those in this room, but anybody else that I'm talking to about the Arctic. Investment in the Arctic is not about Alaskan earmarks. These are national assets for us. And an icebreaker is truly, first and foremost, a national asset. Look at what our neighbors have. The Joneses, the Russia, has 27 icebreakers. 27 icebreakers over there. China has their second icebreaker under construction. They've got another 6 planned. Even India is considering building an icebreaker. We're the richest, we're the most powerful country in the world, and yet we send a very, very poor signal when it comes to how we view our role in the Arctic. And our lack of icebreaking capacity comes as shipping in the Arctic continues to increase. I'm sure you've heard the numbers there. I recognize that the Northern Sea Route numbers are of great interest, but they ignore the regional traffic that really is driving the commercial growth in the region. From 2008 to 12, Bering Strait transits rose from 220 to 480. The U.S. Navy projects that by 2025, the level of Bering Strait traffic will be approximately 1,000 vessels. The recent Committee on the Marine Transportation System report puts it at around 900 vessels. So this is only going to grow. We're only going to see these numbers increasing. And I would suggest that these numbers that we have are probably a little bit on the low side. But I think it's important to acknowledge that when we're talking about the Arctic, when we're talking about the changing Arctic, it's not just about making sure that we have a reliable icebreaker. It's not just about making sure that we're engaged on the oceans. It is about the people who live and work and raise their families in the Arctic as well. I'm not one who thinks that the Arctic needs to be this this snow globe that we put up on the shelf and say, you know, don't touch it, you might break it. The Arctic is home to 4 million people who've been living and hunting and fishing for thousands of years, harvesting the natural resources of the region and developing the land. It is harsh, it is tough up there. And it's not just the climate that delivers pretty harsh conditions. It's just difficult to live where your energy costs are extraordinarily expensive, where your transportation costs are through the roof. And the threats then that the people along our coast particularly feel as they see the changes that come their way. Winter storms that once were diminished by sea ice are now reaching land, and they're eroding the shoreline, in some cases taking the land right out from underneath the buildings, forcing entire communities to relocate. Secretary Jewell was up in the state 2 weeks ago now and was able to visit the community of Kivalina on one of the barrier islands there and see firsthand what has happened with the level of erosion. That community's highest priority right now is a school, but they can't get to building a school because the threat, the fear that that community might not be safe in that place is driving all the other decisions. And so the discussion now is, how do we build an evacuation route out? How do we relocate a community of some 400 people? Relocation of Kivalina is estimated to be anywhere between $100 and $120 million. So, we're dealing with real numbers, we're dealing with big numbers, but more importantly, we're dealing with a people that are resilient and proud and strong and want to find ways to continue to live in the land that they and their families have inhabited for thousands and thousands of years. They want economies that will allow them to continue to live there, but they need to know that it's compatible with their subsistence lifestyle. These are challenges that are difficult to predict and difficult to prepare for, but this is what is before us. I accept the challenge and know that every day we're working to try to figure out how we can do better by planet Earth and the people who inhabit her. So thank you for what you do in your leadership roles in your various capacities, and thanks for the opportunity to be with you. I see that my co-chair of the Arctic Commission,